We're back with the breakfast on PlusTvAfrica. We have our first major conversation. I guess is already standing by, but let's quickly, give you a background to what we're talking about this morning. The Chartered Institute of Bankers of Nigeria has said that the lack of key infrastructure development has impeded the country's growth potential over the years. And according to the chairman of the institute, Ken Opara, government cannot fund infrastructure development alone. He believes that banks need to get involved to develop the economy and that there is a need to start talking about the potential strategies as financiers of infrastructure. He made this known during the 2022 CIBN Fellowship Investiture, which was held recently. This call comes as Nigeria's Minister of Works and Housing, Babatunde Fashola, revealed that the federal government of Nigeria owes contractors about 11.16 trillion naira for the construction of various highways across the country and certificates of completion. The minister, who made this known while defending the proposed budget of his ministry in the 2023 appropriation bill, said his ministry had currently awarded 1,642 highway contracts for 1,632 projects at a total sum of 10.395 trillion naira. 10.395 trillion naira. That's a lot of money. Now, he gave reasons for this, which we will look into look at in a moment, but joining us to share thoughts on this suggestion by the experts at the Chartered Institute of Bankers of Nigeria. We have a gentleman. He's not a stranger to the house. I'm talking about none other than Segun Sopitan. He's a principal partner, Woodridge and Scott Consulting in Ikeja, Lagos. Segun Sopitan, good morning to you, and thank you very much for your time.
Good morning, Kofi.
Good morning.
Good morning, Nigeria.
All right. Now, tell us, how important is infrastructure to the development of Nigeria's economy? For those who are wondering, what is the nexus?
So really, you can't drive development without infrastructure, and when we say infrastructure, I think it's always important I always like talking a language that people can understand and relate with easily. So when we say infrastructure, it's nothing more than roads, rail lines, the power that we use, the water that we drink, because that will be driven by some sort of infrastructure, whether it be dams, or water treatment plants and all of that. So those are the kind of things that we talk about when we talk about infrastructure. And once you understand that, then you realize that without a robust infrastructure framework, without robustly available infrastructure, you can't drive economic development. For example, if you talk about farming, with all of the arable land that we have in the north and all of the food that is produced, a lot of it gets wasted and simply get destroyed. You will not believe, Kofi, over 80% of some farm produce gets wasted between the farm and the markets in Lagos, where most of the consumption happens, and all other parts of the country. And why? Because of poor road networks, because of lack of availability of a rail system that can move these things efficiently and quickly to the marketplace. So you can't de-emphasize the importance of infrastructure in economic development. You can look at the power conundrum.
Okay. Network hasn't been too friendly today, but Segun Sopitan is our expert analyst this morning. We'll try and get back to him. But he was just there trying to, give us the nexus between infrastructure development and the development of Nigeria's economy. And quite interesting, the point he raised about, for instance, perishable items, between the farm and the market. How much of that is lost? That's actually quite shocking. 80% of farm produce lost. It's just spoiled like that because of lack of infrastructure. You begin to wonder what stops us from getting this done. But probably the private sector may be the solution, is what we want him to tell us if this is the case. Segun Sopitan, are you there, please? All right, we'll try and get him back. All right, so please continue with the point you were making.
Yeah, so I was saying power, for example, is another example where infrastructure is critical to development. 80%, between 60 to 80% of economic activity in any thriving economy is driven by small businesses who cannot afford to have their own backup power arrangements the way large corporations can, which means access to public power infrastructure is critical to economic development and growth. And we all know the story here. I mean, 5,000 megawatts of power over the last 23 years is abysmal. It's disgraceful. You know, so we can't underplay the critical importance of infrastructure. The federal government itself has admitted that we have about a $2.3 trillion infrastructure deficit. So even if you're investing $180 billion per annum, you can't meet that infrastructure deficit in 20 years. You know, so it's a really, really big gap, and private money absolutely is the solution. But I don't think that we can afford to limit private money to the banking sector. They simply don't have the capacity to meet the volume of funding and capital required. So when we say private capital, it has to go beyond banks.
So that's why I wanted to. I mean, you've just taken the words out of my mouth now. But let's have you talk further on this particular issue. The fact that we understand that infrastructure is very critical, and we understand that in terms of financing is huge because of the sensitivity of it. It can be allowed in the hands, you know, of the private sector. And so, do you think that, you know, really it's a great idea that we're suggesting that, you know, banks should be involved in this, understanding what it is, how sensitive it is, and the issue of monopoly and control, that we can't allow this happen?
Yeah, so it has to be a very well-designed interplay of policies, regulations, and providing the required you know, that catchphrase enabling environment to ensure that between the private capital, between private operators and government, everything, all the resources that are required to meet this deficit can be provided. So the banking industry is only one sector of the private sector, is only one aspect of private capital. The banking industry, as in the entire banking industry in Nigeria, as at April, for example, the total risk assets volume was $57 billion. And we're saying that the total required funding per annum to meet our infrastructure deficit is over 80 billion, maybe $100 billion. You know, so the banks, whether it's not even so much about the sensitivity, it's simply that the banks alone cannot do this, but they need to play a role. So the government needs to ensure that they bring on board the capacity of the private sector, private operators through PPP arrangements, so that the private people can then go look for private capital and fund this project in such a manner that they can then recoup their investments. The challenge that the government has been having is that they've been unable to create a structure that will guarantee the return on investment that private money will always require before they put their monies into any project. So those are the things that government really needs to look at. How do we ensure that this infrastructure project can be designed in a manner that will generate revenues for private capital? Until that question is addressed, the government will be doing it alone, and they will never meet the deficit because they simply don't have the capacity.
Is it that the government doesn't have the capacity, or is that, you know, the priority for the government has not been on infrastructure? We look at the budget year in, year out, what's been budgeted for capital and recurrent expenditure, right? So is that the case? We also look at where government, you know, pays attention to the cost of running governance, administration. You would want to see how much the president is spending on travel, maintaining his house, and what have you. It's a lot. So do you think that it's the issue of we don't have funds, or is that priority is misplaced?
Basically, we don't have funds. I mean, so there's the problem of the misplaced priority very clearly. But even if you reverse that percentage,
Well, it hasn't been, great with the network this morning, but we hope that we have Sopitan right back with us. He's a principal partner with Woodridge and Scott Consulting. So we continue to talk about the fact that, yes, government doesn't really have resources. There's lack of funding. This, the reason why you have economic experts asking for this sort of partnership now with the the private sector, asking the banks to finance some of the critical infrastructure in the country. And that's for lack of funds. For you to have all of this ideology is because of the lack of funds.
Messi, I'm told we have Segun Sopitan back. Mr. Sopitan, are you there? Can you hear us, please?
This is a part of the challenge that we're talking about. Technology, infrastructure is failing us every day.
Absolutely.
But I can hear you, yes.
Absolutely. The World Bank has put out some information detailing the needs, infrastructure needs of Nigeria. They said that Nigeria needs at least 36 trillion naira every year for the next 30 years for Nigeria to meet its infrastructure needs. 36 trillion naira every year for the next 30 years. Now, I was going to ask you about the 41 trillion naira debt that Nigeria has piled up so far by this federal government. Even though the 36 trillion naira yearly makes that amount of money pale into insignificance, but the Buhari administration has been touting infrastructure investment as a reason mostly why it's going for these loans. 41 trillion naira. Looking at the loan model, taking loans from the Chinese, taking loans from the World Bank, IMF facilities and all that, they're saying they want to use it to fund infrastructure. Have we been able to judiciously show the evidence of that money from what you see around? The Minister of Works had said Nigeria has a 70% deficit as far as road infrastructure is concerned, and they are owing contractors, as we just said in the introduction. So what are your thoughts on this loan model for funding infrastructure? Is it something that is sustainable, that could still be explored, since you said the banks don't have the capital to fund infrastructure alone?
Yeah, so when you use loans to fund any project, what you must ensure is that that project pays the loan back by itself. And that is where our government is failing woefully. You're funding rail projects that are practically commercially unviable. And this is just a reality. And why is this the case? Because the government, by virtue of the unfortunate deep incidents of corruption, is simply unable to put in the arrangements that will guarantee these ventures becoming commercially viable. So you are setting up rails from Abuja to Lagos, from Lagos to Ibadan, across the country. Fantastic projects, nowhere near enough, but the entire system is steeped in corruption, such that there are huge revenue leakages on those projects as they stand. So what is happening is that the government is simply taking borrowed funds, investing in those funds in those projects. Of course, as you alluded to, we don't even have the transparency, we don't have the information to know whether all of the money borrowed is actually going into those projects. But let's even assume that they are. So you are putting the money into those projects, but unfortunately, you are not getting all of the ticketing revenues from those projects to pay those loans back because you don't have electronic ticketing in place. Those projects are running at full capacity. If you look at the Abuja-Kaduna rail line, for example, it's always full. You can't get tickets on those trains. But the tickets, even though they claim to have put in electronic ticketing systems in place, there's a huge racket going on around that. So you're losing revenues. So until the government is sincere enough to implement projects in a manner that will ensure that revenues come from those projects that can pay off those loans, we'll continue to have this situation where we're having budget deficits because we're paying those loans from government revenues rather than from revenues from those projects. I mean, it goes without saying, but unfortunately, simple things are never ever simple in Nigeria. So our structuring and everything is completely wrong, and that's the problem we have. That's why we can't attract private capital. Nobody will put their money into government projects, no sane investor, because they know that the money will never come back.
So apart from the fact that the money will never come back, how about all the factors that we're faced with? I mean, we're in 2022, insecurity is a big issue for us. So how do we address all of that? And we also understand that several government infrastructures have been targeted. For instance, you have the train that has been attacked several times. Has also not been operational. How do we solve all of these problems? As much as you have some economic experts who are advising that the private sector or the bank should get in to fund government infrastructure.
I mean, you're absolutely spot on. And this has been said repeatedly by every stakeholder, including the government themselves. They know these things. Unfortunately, their hands are tied by their interests, by vested interests within the government and outside of the government, who simply are getting huge benefits from the situation that we find ourselves.
Sopitan, can you hear us, please? Of course, we seem to have a disconnect with Sopitan, but we hope that the network will be favorable, and we have him just before we call it a wrap this morning on the show. But that's also very critical, like he's mentioned, Kofi. Do we have him back now? All right, then. So how do you explain the situation where we're asking that? Because if you look at it, there's been an argument over time that government is not, a manager of business. I mean, government is not good in managing business. Government has no business in business. And that's what you have economics saying. And that principally, government exists to provide an enabling environment. And that would mean taking care of the issue of governance. Let there be security of lives and properties. And that would also attract investors. If government actually provide an enabling environment, then it would also enable us, it will enable investors to come in. The private sector will thrive. Sopitan, it's good to have you back. Let's have you continue with your thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, so I was saying, the vested interests within government circles and outside of government circles, within the security infrastructure and all of that, don't want the insecurity situation fixed. Because insecurity in itself is a big business for those that are benefiting from it. And that's the only reason that this thing continues to thrive. And until it's fixed, you are very absolutely correct. Private capital will run away because nobody wants to invest money in a rail line when there is a 50% likelihood. Imagine that, 50%, maybe even more likelihood that the rail line is going to get blown up, and then your ability to recoup your funds are gone. So until we get a government in place that takes the bold steps, bold, audacious steps that are required to fix these issues, to address the insecurity issue from a military combative perspective, but also from the community relations perspective and the poverty and education perspective, then we cannot, get above these problems. So insecurity is driven by poverty and illiteracy. It's a breeding ground for, operatives. When you have so many unemployed youths, so many uneducated youths, there's that. And then there's the fact that there's a lot of sympathy within local communities for some of this insecurity because they benefit from the economy that insecurity generates. So the government has to be sincere, has to be up and about to address these issues from a short-term perspective and from a long-term perspective. Otherwise, private capital will never come. It's just as simple as that. Private capital will come into places like Lagos, maybe Port Harcourt,
all right.
Maybe to a certain degree, maybe a fund analyzed as we currently stand.
All right, Segun Sopitan, I'm sure the CIBN, because they are in the industry, in the sector, they're well aware of the issues, and this advice, has some sense in it. Like you said, even though the banks cannot do it all alone, you also, I'm sure, agree that government can do it on their own. But I think this also brings up the issue of the role of our commercial banks, and maybe, I don't know, should I say maybe investment banks in national life. I mean, my late father, Mr. C.J. Bartels of blessed memory, used to complain time without number that the banks are not living up to what banks should do, the role of banking in the economy, especially in the days when the banks were selling JAM forms and WAEC forms. My father was so angry He said this is not what the bank should be doing. They have a greater role to play than to sell JAM forms and WAEC forms. Are Nigerian banks, have Nigerian banks been able to now emerge to play the role banking should play in an economy? Are we seeing that? Because what the CIBN chief is saying, there's some message there that you guys need to do more. There's a lot more that can be done. Are they really living up to the expectation? Is there some other thing behind the scenes that people just set up banks because they know there's a quack to do to get money? Remember the days of round tripping?
You're right. And as a former, in fact, still a current player in that sector, I have to say, you know, that our banks are doing nowhere area of when funding and capital and, you know, loans, generating risk assets and giving loans credit to the economy, to you know, credit anywhere in the world is the air that the economy breathes. So if you look at the United States of America, if you look at places like Canada, the UK, Germany, all developed economies, especially in the West, you find that development is primarily has a direct correlation to availability of credit and accessibility to credit by the larger population. Whether you talk about consumer credit or you talk about infrastructure funding, structured finance, you know, and all of that. And our banks, unfortunately, sometimes not entirely due to their own fault, because there are structural problems within the Nigerian economy that acts as a disincentive for funding. For example, if you wanted to provide credit to, say, a player within the infrastructure value chain, as a bank, you must protect the capital of your depositors and your shareholders. And unfortunately, we simply don't have
challenge with Segun Sopitan. We might have to leave it at that for now. Sure, he's just simply trying to say the banks will not put their money or in investors' money into where they're not sure it will be safe. You know, so until they're sure that they have confidence to invest mercy in the parts of the economy that will be safe, they will keep it. So there are structural environmental issues that are affecting the confidence of the banks too. But the banks need to do more still. When we go to the banks, let's at least be able to change and acquire foreign currency. Let's also be able to get loans at reasonable rates, and also when we put our money in the banks, give us some real good
interest.
Don't
so but the interest now,
₦5 naira per year. Stop
but
fleecing people.
If you look at the interest rate now, just to mention, I think it has to do with the economic factor. The interest right now, because looking at the policy of government and the economy, there might just be a need for people to save. So what the government is doing, or what the money policy as Central Bank and Apex Bank is encouraging more savings.
I'm talking about when you put your money in the bank.
That's what I'm saying.
Give me a good rate.
So the rates now, the rates
when I come to you
increased.
to ask for money, when I come to you to ask for money,
it's no longer ₦5 naira. If you have,
when I come to ask for money, you are asking me to pay a high amount of interest for the loan. When I put my money in your bank in the savings account, don't give me one naira per annum. That's stealing.
That's what I'm saying. That's why I'm saying
they're not being fair. Segun Sopitan, thank you for your time.
Kofi, that's why I'm saying that if you look at the current reality now.
Thank you for your time.
If you look at the
banks
current
are
reality
fleecing
now,
people. They need to stop. When people put their monies in savings accounts, give them a respectable interest, because they're doing business with your money and they are making a lot of money.
So I think that it has to do with, you know, the
we're paying SMS fee. We are paying data fee. We are paying all sorts of account maintenance.
Absolutely.
Oh my
but Kofi, if you look at what I'm trying to say is that if you look at the current reality now, is that there seemed to be an increase. So if you were getting ₦5 naira now, it's different. So the interest rate has actually increased, and that's what it is. Maybe it follows, you know, the trend of.
The interest rate hasn't really increased from a deposit point of view. And the point that Kofi makes is a very, very critical point, you know, and this has been a problem even back in my day when I was in the banking industry. I used to be one of the lone voices that used to speak about this, you know, like What you're speaking about, Kofi, is the margin. And there is a regulatory margin between the savings rate and the lending rate. But the banks never comply with this. So you have a situation where you are giving out today, if you take your money to the bank, Mercy, you will not get more than 5 to 6% on your savings account.
And that's not 5 naira anymore. That's what I'm trying to say.
It's
different because with the current economic activities. I'm not happy with the banks. There's nothing to write home about. But
listen to the expert. Listen to the expert.
Yes, no, he's
saying your money.
No, I'm not saying. I'm sharing what's happening right now, and he's agreeing, and that's what it is. The truth is that yes, we understand that the margin is slim. Yes. But that, there's a change now, maybe because of the fact that the economic policy is encouraging people to save more money rather than spending. And so you have the interest rate that has moved from 5 naira to something else.
We have to go. Segun Sopitan, thank you very much for this time. We'll have some time, maybe sometime later, to talk about the margin between the lending rate and the saving rate, I think. Appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Mercy, someone is stealing your money, we're telling you they're stealing, shortchanging you. You should be angry. We have to go and we'll take a break. When we come back, we'll look at some more issues. Please stay with us. It's still The Breakfast on PlusTvAfrica.